everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today is our latest Sounds of the Classics episodes where we talk about the NES. This is Volume 2, because we did have a Sounds of the Classics episode focused on the NES before. This is our second edition, looking at the NES. We're going to talk all about that topic in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, Snatch Bandicoot, NYC Lewis W., Martin Steiner, James Nunn, Yuzu Soda, Vince Gameplays, Ham and Dagger, and Marek. Thanks to our patrons for supporting the show, and thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deeper into the sounds of the classics for the Nintendo Entertainment System, I figured it'd be a good idea to let you all know why I chose to do a Volume 2 of NES Classic Sounds. And the simple fact is, because the NES holds a special place in my heart. I believe I've relayed this story a few times before, but just in case, when I was younger, I was a Nintendo kid. I loved everything to do with Nintendo. Now, I did not begin gaming on the Nintendo Entertainment System. No, I began gaming in the arcades in the early 80s. I have fond memories of going with my aunt to a local arcade in Philadelphia known as the Galaxy, and I would play all sorts of games. I'd play skee-ball, I would play Karate Champ, I would play this really cool game called Gladiator, where you'd walk around and you'd have armor on top of you, and you could change the positional strikes that you could have. You could hit either like the head or the torso or the legs, and enemies could do the same. And they could knock pieces of armor off of you, and you could knock pieces of armor off of them, and you had to try to kill them before they killed you. It was glorious. It was a glorious time, and I loved going to arcades. But even though I went to arcades very regularly, I always wanted to be able to play video games in the home. And back in the early 80s, if we were going to do that, that meant getting an Atari system like the Atari 2600. Now, we looked at those systems multiple times. There would be plenty of times we'd be walking around the mall and we would see the Atari 2600 sitting on a store shelf. And we would think to ourselves, well, maybe we should get it. Maybe we should get the Atari so we could play in the home. But for whatever reason, we never did. I never owned an Atari system back when I was younger. But I loved video games, and everybody in my family knew how much I loved video games. So finally, fast forward a few years, the Nintendo Entertainment System comes out in North America, and we got the NES. We bought the NES along with the 3-pack pack-in title between Super Mario Bros., Duck Hunt, and World Class Track Meet, I think it was called. With the Power Pad, we got the Power Pack. So we had the Zapper, we had the controllers, we had the Power Mat. Oh my God, my life was forever changed once we got that NES. I still remember my father hooking it up to our TV, and then when I hit that power button and I saw what I could play in the comfort of my home without needing to feed a bunch of quarters into a machine, I was hooked for life. The NES became an absolutely influential and instrumental video game release in my own personal life. I loved the NES. I accumulated a library of a couple of hundred titles back when I was younger. I just loved spending so much time playing my NES, all sorts of games. I would play the classics. I would play the not so classics. Sometimes I would get games that were well intentioned, but ultimately really were not that great. But it didn't matter because I had a video game system in my home and I was able to play it anytime I wanted, at least when somebody wasn't watching TV otherwise. But I love the NES. So when we sat down to create our first Sounds of the Classics episode, back, I guess it was episode 60 at this point, to put it into comparison, this is technically episode 180. So a good 3 years ago at this point, three-ish, a little bit over 3 years ago. Two years? Sorry, like 2.5 years ago. My math skills have suffered, apparently. But around 2.5 years ago, we sat down and we did our first NES, or our first Sounds of the Classics episode, which was focused on the NES. And there was a reason why I chose the NES as our first Sounds of the Classics episode. Because, like I just said, the NES was absolutely my indoctrination into home video gaming, at least to any great degree. I mean, I had Tiger Electronics games and different portable systems that were not really consoles, but more one-off LCD, very simple kinds of games, which I did love at the time. But the NES is really what brought video gaming into my home, and I absolutely loved it. So, of course, when we first did our first Sounds of the Classics, the NES had to be front and center. But since then, we've done a bunch of other Sounds of the Classics episodes. We've focused on the Super Nintendo. We focused on different gaming genres. We even did one focused on a singular game, Final Fantasy X, back for episode 160. We've done a ton of different Sounds of the Classics episodes. But I always knew, in my heart, that we would be coming back to the NES. That's why when I released the NES episode way back 2.5 years ago, I labeled it as Volume 1. And actually, I think I've labeled every Sounds of the Classics almost as Volume 1, because I always want to keep going back and revisiting other things that I might not have had time to get into a singular episode. The NES being literally the system that brought video games into my personal life on a daily basis, had to be the very first of the standalone Sounds of the Classics that became a Volume 2. We did have a listener grab bag Volume 2, but that's a little bit different because that's really driven by all of you, not so much me. The NES is incredibly important to me, so of course, when I was starting to think about what our first true Volume 2 Sounds of the Classics was going to be, or at least true in the sense of based on my own thoughts, perceptions, and perspective, it had to be the Nintendo Entertainment System. So, with that said, we are going to go through some of the songs from various NES games that have meant something to me over the years, and even beyond the music. What are the games that meant something to me? Why do I love these games so much, or why do I remember these games so much? We're going to talk through a bunch today, as we always do. I have no doubt there will eventually be a Volume 3, because like I said, the NES is incredibly important to me. But for today, we're going to focus on around 10-ish, maybe a little bit more, depending on how much time we have. Different selections from NES games and their music that have meant something to me over the years. And we're going to start with our very first song, which is the title screen from G.I. Joe. Look, I grew up in the 80s, which meant I was exposed to a number of different cartoons of the era. Things like Transformers. I used to love Japanese animation as well. There were a couple of shows, Voltron being, of course, probably the most or one of the more well-known ones. But then there was also Transor Z, which was another awesome robot show that I absolutely loved. But there were also other cartoons that were even more mainstream. G.I. Joe was one of those cartoons. I absolutely loved G.I. Joe. I loved all of the different characters. I loved the concept of having this squad of ultra talented, ultra trained soldiers that were able to combat the menace that was Cobra and take the fight to the enemies and save the day and be the heroes we all knew that they were. I loved watching G.I. Joe. I especially loved some of the G.I. Joe movies, so to speak, that had come out. I particularly loved when Sergeant Slaughter made his way over to the cast of G.I. Joe. For anybody who doesn't know, Sergeant Slaughter was a WWF wrestler who I really liked, and I really appreciated the fact that they did this kind of crossover thing. I am sure that it was focused on making money. I have no doubt in my mind, looking back today, that the reason that that crossover even existed was to just make money for people, but it doesn't matter. I still loved Sergeant Slaughter, this drill sergeant, this hardcore drill sergeant being part of G.I. Joe. I loved Duke. I loved General Hawk, Roadkill, Snake Eyes. Oh my, I can't even. And even on the bad guy side, you have Destro and Cobra Commander and Serpentor and what was it? Was it Globulus? Was that the big snake guy played by Burgess Meredith in the G.I. Joe movie? I think that was his name. Oh, I really loved the fight scene between Sergeant Slaughter and the hornet looking guy with the spikes on his elbow. I had all of the toys. I had the play sets. I loved G.I. Joe. So you've got to imagine what my thought process was when I heard there was a G.I. Joe game on the NES. I mean, I don't remember exactly what I thought, but I think it was something to the effect of, oh yeah, absolutely, I need to get that game. And I did get the game, and I played through it a bunch when I was younger. I don't remember having any negative feelings about G.I. Joe the game. I believe, and I've done a little bit of research, I believe modern discourse on G.I. Joe for the NES is not entirely kind. I'd have to take a look at that myself, because all I know is when I played G.I. Joe when I was younger, I absolutely loved it. I loved the fact that you could pick from several different characters. I loved the different stages you could progress through. It was kind of, if I'm remembering correctly, it was kind of a side-scrolling, pseudo-Contra-esque kind of game. I mean, not technically Contra-esque, but it was a side-scrolling action platforming kind of experience. And I remember the different characters have different abilities that you could utilize as you're going through the different stages. It was great. It was an amazing game, and I loved being able to control all of these different characters that I had only previously either seen on my television screen or played with the action figures. And my brother and I had so many G.I. Joe action figures. We had an entire backpack, and that was just the ones that we played with on a daily basis. We had a whole backpack full of G.I. Joe action figures, and we would use those action figures with any number of different playsets. It didn't have to be a G.I. Joe playset. No, you remember the Ghostbusters firehouse, the big freestanding firehouse thing that was a few feet high? Well, G.I. Joe used to go on plenty of adventures. Our characters used to go on plenty of adventures in that firehouse to thwart whatever bad guy menace there was. We had more crossovers than the MCU. I mean, we had so much fun back then. But G.I. Joe the game, being able to play these characters, being able to see their skills that you had previously only seen in the cartoon, or maybe imagined as you were playing with the action figures, seeing these characters, these different people, being able to select between them, being able to go on missions, be the hero and save the day, that, for me, when I was younger, was absolutely amazing. And for that, I will always remember G.I. Joe on the NES. We're going to move on to our next song on the list, which comes from Super Mario Bros. 2. This was the overworld theme for Super Mario 2. I know that we've talked in different capacities about Super Mario Bros. 2 and the fact that that game deviated so dramatically from the original experience. Super Mario Bros., the one that I just talked about, was the pack-in title for my NES when I originally got it. I remember when I first got Super Mario Bros. 2. I remember this vividly. I had been playing Super Mario Bros. 1 for an extended period of time. I beat the game multiple times. I would play through that game any chance I got because I thought Super Mario Bros. 1 was absolutely phenomenal. And when I heard that Super Mario Bros. 2 was available, that I was able to buy another Mario game, I was so excited because Mario 1 was so great. So we got Super Mario Bros. 2. We put it into the console. We hit power. And I sat down to begin playing it, and the first thing I noticed was that I could choose from one of 4 different characters. You had Toad, you had Princess Peach, you had Luigi, and Mario. And I thought to myself, I'm not going to choose any of those losers. I'm going to choose Mario because Mario's the main guy. So I picked Mario, and I got into that very first mission, and I start falling from the sky. And then I notice this is very different. This is a very different experience than what I was used to with the original Super Mario Bros. And it kind of messed with my head a little bit. I was really proficient with the original Super Mario Bros. I could run through those levels. I could stomp a bunch of Koopas and Goombas on the head, and it didn't matter. I was able to move through there, and I became very proficient with the original game. Super Mario Bros. 2 just did not click with me. I knew it needed to. And this is a child brain. I had just gotten this game. I had just gotten this brand new game. It's supposed to be great. It's in the Mario series. Now, granted, it was only the second one, but it was Super Mario. I loved the original game, so of course I have to love the new game. Plus, it was given to me as a gift, so how could I not love it? I would be ungrateful. I would be an ungrateful bastard if I didn't love this game. So I sat there, I kept trying to play it, and I could not get past the very first level. I would finally figure out how to pick up all the different things from the ground and throw it around and pick up the potions to go to the special little shadow world and get some additional hit points and all that kind of stuff. I would figure that part out. But then I got to Birdo, the very first simple boss in the game. I got up to Birdo and I could not figure out how to beat that darn bird. I guess he's a bird, right? Yeah, the Super Mario cartoon definitely portrays him as a bird, even though he doesn't fly around the screen at all in this game. No, was it the very first episode? I know, mild tangent. I think it was the very first episode of the Super Mario cartoon where Birdo kidnaps Toad, thinking that Toad is one of her babies or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, I got up to Birdo and I couldn't figure out how to beat it. I couldn't figure out. I'd see them shoot these egg-like projectiles at me, and I'd be like, okay, I guess I can jump or avoid them. I avoided the eggs. Maybe I would jump on top of the eggs and fly around a little bit, but I couldn't figure out how to beat that stupid enemy. So I was talking to my aunt, and listen, I've spoken a lot about my aunt before. She raised me from a very young age. I love her very much, and we always used to play games together. And she was watching me, and at the time that this came out, I guess she would have to be in her mid-20s at this point when we're playing this game. And she was watching me play the game, and she's like, well, here, let me have a turn. And I would give her the controller and she'd play around a little bit, but we couldn't figure out how to beat Birdo at all. So I went to sleep. I went to bed that night and I was like, I can't figure it out. We'll have to figure it out in the morning. I went to sleep, and then I woke up the next morning and I was resolved to figure out how to beat this stupid bird in this game. So I went downstairs. I went over to the console and I found a note. My aunt had written me a note overnight, and she had said, hey, I figured it out. I figured out how to beat Birdo. You have to jump on the eggs, and then you pick them up just like you would pick up something from the ground. And then you toss the eggs at Birdo, and then you could do damage to him, and then you could eventually get past the level. And I thought, oh my God, of course, that makes perfect sense. So I sat down, I played the game, and I got past Birdo, and then eventually moved on later in the game. But she had actually stayed up later that night to try to figure it out, to help me out as far as how to get past that silly bird. I will always remember that. I wish I still had that note. I don't believe I do because, geez, that was almost 40 years ago at this point. But I always appreciated that. I will always remember that. Super Mario 2, I would continue to play. And I'd continue to play it over and over and over again. But it really never truly clicked with me because It wasn't the same. It wasn't the same as Super Mario Bros. I would eventually beat Super Mario Bros. 2 back when I was younger, although, little asterisk, I did use the Game Genie to beat that game when I was younger. I wanted to finally beat the game, so I used the Game Genie in order to give myself, I guess it was probably infinite lives or something like that, but I gave myself infinite lives. I played the game. I finally beat Wart at the end of the game, and I thought to myself, finally, I have beaten this game. Now, I did go back later on to play the game, and I will admit that I have not gone back to the NES original to put in the time needed to actually beat the NES original. I did beat the Super Mario 2 Advance version of the game on the Game Boy Advance. So I have beaten the game, at least in that format, but I have not gone back to beat the original NES version. I have no doubt that I will at some point because it's out there and it is a really significant part of my early video game history. So I will go back and play that. But beyond that, beyond just the game and feeling how different it was and all that kind of stuff, I have a very vivid amount of memory for Super Mario 2, both because of that experience with my aunt where she stayed up all night trying to figure out how to beat that enemy just to leave me a note in the morning so that I wouldn't be frustrated, all the way through to trying to play the game to completion, eventually relenting and using the Game Genie, and now having it be part of my own personal retro game backlog that I have to go back and eventually beat. I will always remember Super Mario 2 for those reasons, but even beyond that, the music is great. I mean, it's very different music than what you would have in the original Super Mario Bros., but it didn't matter. The music is so good. And I have a little bit of a guilty pleasure in that I will often look up piano covers, like ragtime or piano covers of Super Mario 2 music, simply because I think it sounds so amazing and I just want to experience more of that music. So Super Mario 2 definitely holds a special place in my heart, and the music is absolutely amazing. We're going to move on to our third game on the list, which is Gunsmoke. This is the music from Stage 1 to Gunsmoke, which was entitled Hicksville, which is probably the most recognizable song from the game, at least from my own personal experience. Man, Gunsmoke. This is another one that the reason I like it so much is because of the real life stuff that was happening around this time. I would oftentimes with my brother, I've spoken so much about different things my brother and I would play, but back when we were younger, we would often play different games where we would be either cops and robbers, or we would be different groups, and one of us would be the good guy, one of us would be the bad guy, and we used to play cowboys and Indians. Now, I know that using the term Indian is offensive, and I am not using that to be offensive, but back when we played this game, back when we were playing, that's what it was known as. It was known as Cowboys and Indians. So please, no offense to anybody is intended at all. That's just what we used to play. And we would always be the cowboys, or at least I would always want to be the cowboy. I'd always want to be the guy waltzing into town with the gun strapped to his hip in his holster and battle the quote-unquote bad guys in that scenario. And I just loved the whole concept of the cowboy. I would get dressed up for Halloween in cowboy outfits. I would buy a bunch of different plastic sheriff badges because I just thought it was so cool to be a sheriff in the Wild West. We even collected a bunch of toy guns. And I don't know if anybody remembers this. Certainly in the 80s, but even into the 90s, I think, and I don't know if they still exist today, there were these things called cap guns. And we were never allowed to get a BB gun because, hey, we'd shoot our eye out. But outside of the BB guns, there were these things called cap guns, which did not fire a projectile. But basically what they were these little miniature rings that had some sort of explosive is too strong of a word, but there was some material in there that when it would be struck by the hammer of the gun, it would literally go Like it'd be like a little mini pop kind of thing, and a little bit of smoke would rise from the gun. So I don't know exactly what the materials were that went into those quote unquote caps for the cap guns, but we would have these and we would play around and we would pretend to shoot at each other or the bad guys in our imagination. And it was so much fun. And I still remember a couple of the different play sets or the play guns that we had back then. I had one that was basically a shotgun. This was not a cap gun. This was just a pure shotgun. And actually, now that I remember, or now that I'm thinking about it, we had purchased that shotgun back from a store. I believe it was Clover. I think it was Clover in Philadelphia, where my aunt was working at the time. And we found this cool shotgun where you could have the little hand, I guess, what is it? A cock? I guess to cock the gun, and you would pull the trigger and it would make this loud noise. And I hope I still have that somewhere. It's probably at my parents' house somewhere. I hope, because that was really cool. It was all metal. It was a really cool thing. And I had other guns as well, fake guns, obviously, that were these cap guns and all that kind of stuff. We loved playing and pretending to be cowboys. And very similar to my story about G.I. Joe, when I found a game that allowed me to actually be a cowboy, and go around and save the day and clean up the Wild West of all of the outlaws and villains. And I just loved it. I loved that game. I loved starting each mission and seeing the wanted poster of the enemy, of the leader, the bad leader of that particular stage that you were going after. I loved the concept of going on these bounty missions to be able to bring those individuals to justice and eventually pocket my own dollars because I saved the day. I was the cowboy or the sheriff or whatever that actually did it. I really enjoyed Gunsmoke, and that first stage, the first stage music, is one that has always stuck with me. And I don't know why sometimes certain music stays with you literally for your entire life. Because similar to some of the other songs that we're talking through, this is a very old game. This is a game that I have played off and on over the years, but I haven't really played it appreciably since I was very, very young. Yet it doesn't matter. As soon as I think about Gunsmoke, I think about the song, I'm not going to do it again because we just listened to it, but it was so much fun. And it was such a great game. I have to go back and play that at some point. I did do a little bit of research on Gunsmoke, by the way, as a potential future episode of the podcast. And what I discovered was, I don't think there was a whole lot out there about the history of Gunsmoke. I mean, Gunsmoke did come out in the arcade. There was an older television show from, I want to say, maybe the 50s or 60s. I think I could be making that up, but I know there was a television show. I just don't remember the exact era of television it was from that was called Gunsmoke. I'm not 100% positive if there was a crossover or if the Gunsmoke game was based, at least in part, on the Gunsmoke television series. Like I said, I didn't do a ton of research here. I just did enough to see if there was enough material to really construct a good history behind the game. And I remember thinking to myself, there may not be enough there, but it doesn't matter. In the future, I'm going to do, if we want to cover Gunsmoke, we'll cover Gunsmoke. I'll figure out how to kind of weave a history around that, whatever that ends up being. But Gunsmoke was one of those games, another one of those games that I just absolutely loved playing when I was younger, and it holds such a special place in my heart. And every time I hear the music, it reminds me of my youth, and it reminds me of those times playing with my brother and running around our family room and all throughout the house, and even sometimes in the backyard, just being totally silly and trying to bring our imaginary bad guys to justice. For that, I will always remember Gunsmoke. We're going to move on to our next game on the list, which is Shadowgate. This was the song from the entryway as you begin playing the game. Shadowgate is a game that scared the pants off of me when I was younger. I remember being so freaked out by Shadowgate. This is one of those games that I never actually owned, at least on the NES. I had never purchased Shadowgate, but I remember renting the game. And I remember, I want to say, and this is one of those things, you know how we always talk about the box for the games that we talk about, and I always look at the back of the box and all that kind of stuff, and we talk about how the box really means something and how different companies marketed their titles and all that kind of stuff. Well, I remember going to our local video game store, and I remember seeing the Shadowgate box on the shelf. Not necessarily the back of the box in this case, but the front of the box, with that gargoyle-like creature with the red eyes and the pointed tail with red on the end of it, which almost certainly had to be blood. At least in my mind, it was always like, oh, this gargoyle is erupting from its stone encasement and it's attacking somebody. Now, in reality, maybe that tail was just the color of the tail as the stones fall away from it. But I remember that box, and I remember the first time we rented the game and I put it in my NES, and I thought to myself, this is so scary. This is such a scary game. There was death at every turn. You had to make sure that you picked up torches in order just to stay alive. There were so many different scenarios here that you could experience and potentially die. Death was literally around every corner. And I remember when I was younger, I didn't get all that far into the game. Back then, I didn't have quite as much of a thought process around adventure games because Shadowgate ultimately is an adventure game. I didn't really have the thought process for figuring out and dealing with adventure games in that capacity. So I would often hit a wall, or I wouldn't be able to figure out how to progress forward, or I would keep dying in a certain spot. And I'd be just like, man, this is a really hard game. I guess I'm going to have to put it down. Plus, coupled with the fact that it was a spooky game, at least to me, back when I was younger. And it was one of those games that we would rent. We probably rented it 2 or 3 times over the course of our earlier lives and never beat it. Never beat it back then. I have since then gone back and played the original Shadowgate, along with the Shadowgate remake that came out at this point, probably over a decade ago. I don't even remember exactly when that one came out. So I definitely enjoy Shadowgate. I have not gone back to beat the NES version of the game. And that's something we probably should do. We've already covered Deja Vu. We've already covered Uninvited. We probably should go back and do Shadowgate, because that was the only other NES version of the Mac Venture series that actually came out. Deja Vu 2, which was the 4th Mac Venture game, that did not come out on the NES, despite the fact that Nintendo Power said it was going to come out on the NES and made me so excited for it, and then it never did. It did eventually get released as a compilation pack for, I believe, the Game Boy Color, if I'm not mistaken. But putting Deja Vu 2 aside, because we're not talking about Deja Vu 2 right now, we're talking about Shadowgate. Shadowgate will always hold a special place in my memories because I remember the box on the shelf. And that's one of those things. Like I said, we talk about the boxes for these games. And I'm sure some people might be thinking, whatever, the box for the game. Sure. I'm sure that some boxes look cool, or the back of the box might sound cool, or whatever. But I'm telling you, sometimes the box is what gives you the impression and makes you want to play a game. I did not know anything about Shadowgate the first time that I walked over to it in our local video rental store and picked it up and thought, well, I probably want to play this. But I saw the box, and the box looked interesting to me. It looked gothic. It looked mysterious. It looked spooky. And I thought to myself, well, I've got to play this game. So I did. I picked up the hang tag from that rental display. I brought it up to the counter. We rented Shadowgate, played it. Like I said, never really beat it back when I was younger, but you don't have to beat a game to have fond memories of it. And I just have fond memories of Shadowgate. I have fond memories of being scared out of my mind and not knowing what was going to happen, or not knowing how to defeat a dragon, or not knowing how to progress further, or encountering any number of different scenarios and creatures that just wanted to kill me. I was not ready for that style of game. I had not played anything really like that when I had originally played Shadowgate for the first time. I was completely clueless. Now I know a lot better, and I've played a ton of different adventure games, so I kind of have that thought process down now, but back then I did not. But regardless, I still love Shadowgate, and I still love the music from it, and it still brings me back to my youth, and it's just one of those things where nostalgia is a powerful drug, and I certainly have nostalgia for Shadowgate. We're going to move on to our next video game on the list, which is or Die 2. Now I've got a confession to make. Even though I grew up in the 80s and 90s, I have never set foot on a skateboard. Never, ever. And I know how pervasive skateboard usage was amongst my peer group of the time. Skateboards were everywhere. You would see all sorts of different cool tricks. People riding skateboards on TV, people riding skateboards in movies. All you had to do was look out your front window and you see people skateboarding around your neighborhood. Skateboarding was everywhere. And I know skateboarding still exists today, but back then it felt like something really edgy to do. I don't know if that was just the marketing around skateboard usage in general, but it felt like an edgy kind of thing. I've never stepped on a skateboard. I have absolutely atrocious balance. I don't think I've ever told anybody, or at least not on the podcast, about the fact that I have, if you could have negative balance, that would be me. I am not the kind of guy that you're going to want to put on any sort of platform that has wheels underneath it, because almost certainly that platform will fly out from under me and I will fall right on my butt, or worse, maybe on my back. And now I'm getting older. I don't want to do any back injuries. Geez. But anyway, I've never used a skateboard ever. I've barely used roller skates because, once again, balance, tricky for me. But anyway, skateboards I've never really used. So of course, what would be a great game to get for somebody who never used a skateboard? Skate or Die 2, a game all about skateboarding. I had no idea. I had no concept other than seeing skateboarding around, like I was just talking about. I had no concept of what it meant to skate on a board. I still don't, really, other than knowing you got to keep your balance and you don't want to fall. But playing Skate or Die 2 exposed me to a different kind of game featuring a different kind of skill that I personally do not have in my real life. And most of the time when I sit down to play something, it gives me some form of escapism. It gives me an ability to do something that I wouldn't be able to do in real life. As an example, when I play a fantasy RPG and I swing my big ass sword around and cleave enemies in two, well, you're not going to really do that in real life. Number one, because we no longer live in medieval times. But secondly, because that's just not the thing to do nowadays. And plus, where do you get a sword like that? That's really anyway. But the games that I play a lot of times offer escapism. They give you experiences that you can't otherwise experience in real life. Skating, or more specifically skateboarding, is something I technically could experience in real life. I just wasn't good at it. I just didn't have the balance. So games like Skate or Die 2 allowed me to live out those kind of fantasy experiences where I could ride around on a skateboard and keep my balance and pull off all sorts of tricks. And it was just really fun. And the reason, actually, so I remember the game for that reason, simply because it gave me an experience that I couldn't actually perform in real life. But secondly, one of the main reasons I remember this particular song, which is entitled, perhaps unsurprisingly, Skate or Die, is the fact that I actually heard real voice coming out of my NES. I mean, it was very compressed, it was very digitized, but to hear a song that basically said, skate or die, skate, or, we literally just listened to it again. I don't know why I go into my own renditions of some of these songs when we have literally just listened to the song, but hey, I guess that's me. But I remember thinking, whoa, wait a second. Was that a voice? Was that somebody singing, so to speak, in a song on an NES game? That is crazy. I don't even know how that could possibly be, because up to that point, all of the music I had heard from my NES were just the traditional chiptune kind of music that you would hear from any other NES game. So even beyond the act of skateboarding or giving me that fantasy escapism of being able to be an actual skateboarder, beyond that, the song itself has stuck with me because of that digitized voice, which I believe was the very first time I ever heard digitized voice in an NES game. I'm sure there are others out there I know there are others out there that have some degree of digitized voice. I was just playing Karate Champ recently, and if I'm not mistaken, I hope I'm not making this up, but before each of the fights, the referee guy says, fight, or something like that. Am I making that up? Was that just the arcade version? Oh, now my memories are playing tricks with me. But I know there were other games that had digitized voice even on the NES. But this was the first time I heard digitized voice as part of a song, and that has always stuck with me. So yes, the game was cool to play, but the song and that experience of hearing an actual voice come out of my NES, that was something special. And I know that that must sound really odd to some people who may not have grown up in an era of gaming where voice couldn't be included in the songs in your games because there just wasn't enough storage space to allow that. But Skate or Die 2 surprised me, and the song has always stuck with me, so it makes perfect sense that we would include it in today's episode. We're going to move on to our next game on the list, which is Snake, Rattle, and Roll. How can you listen to this song and not immediately get in a good mood? It is so bouncy. It sounds so cool. It just gives you the impression that this is going to be a fun game. In reality, the game is fun, but it's also brutally difficult. I mean, brutally difficult. I still remember playing Snake, Rattle, and Roll. And once again, I'm going to talk about some times playing the game with my brother, because while I would play Snake, Rattle, and Roll as a solo competitor, so to speak, most of the time playing Snake, Rattle, and Roll was me and my bro going around and trying to beat all these different levels. I remember us trying to eat up as much of those little springy ball thingies that appear. That's the technical term. Springy ball thingies that would appear in the game world, eating them up, trying to make your own snake body grow larger and then step on the little scale that would determine whether you can move on to the next level or not, which would ring the bell and then you could move on. I remember these giant feet or these foot things trying to stomp you into oblivion, which would make you lose the progress that you've had, your snake body that you've built up. I remember these holes in the ground that would sometimes appear, or you could stand on this platform kind of like a sewer and hit the button and it would pop up, and sometimes it'd be life that you could get there and expand your snake body again. I remember the specific isometric projection kind of viewpoint, the isometric viewpoint, where the game was not a just flat kind of thing. It felt 3D. You could jump up different platforms, and so a lot of times you had to jump up different platforms. I remember how darn tricky it was to get down from platforms without accidentally falling to your death. I remember a ton about that game, but I remember most the music. The music was jaunty. It was bopping. It put you in the mood. It put you in the mood to play a game. And this is an example of where music can dramatically improve the experience of playing a game. Because Snake, Rattle, and Roll, like I mentioned, is brutally difficult, or at least it was for me back when I was younger. I haven't gone back to play it in years and years and years. I probably should, just to see if it really is as brutally difficult as I remember it. But it was very difficult. It was a very challenging game. And I've shared this before, but while I like challenging games, I am not going to say that I don't experience some frustration playing those challenging experiences. Sometimes I rage pretty darn hard at these games. I just do. I mean, that's just part of me. That's part of who I am. I try to control it because you're supposed to, but I definitely get irritated sometimes. But I don't remember getting all that irritated with Snake, Rattle, and Roll. And I believe a large reason why, or a big reason why that is because the music was happy. The music made you feel happy. Even the little Jaws music that would play when you would be in the water and the one creature would try to get you, it was like, even that, it was kind of done in a comical kind of way. The colors were vibrant and bright. Everything about the game, other than the brutal difficulty, made it feel like a fun experience. The music included, and the music probably more so than any other aspect of the game. And I've always remembered the music. Even though the game itself is one of those games that today, if I sat down to play it, I would probably curse under my breath or potentially just curse out loud because of how challenging it might be, the music soothes me. The music puts me in a good mood. And when you're in a good mood, even if you're experiencing something frustrating or challenging, it's not so bad. And that's exactly what the music for Snake, Rattle, and Roll did for me. I do want to go back and play that game at some point in the future and see just if my original impressions or my memories of those impressions were still valid or not. I don't know if we'll have a full episode on it at some point. We may. But I can safely say that the music from Snake, Rattle, and Roll has stuck with me over the years. It makes me happy just listening to that music. And for that reason, I had to include it in our episode. We're going to move on to our next game on the list, which is Track and Field 2. It may not be a surprise to some of you to learn that I actually really enjoy watching sporting events, and specifically, I love watching the track and field events from various Olympic Games that usually take place in the summer, at least every 4 years in the summer. I love watching the sprint and the hurdles and the pole vault and everything else. I really enjoy those track-based events, even though from a personal perspective, I've never really competed myself in a track and field event. I was never really that fast. I mean, I could run fine, and there was a period of my life where I had been training for a marathon. I never actually did the marathon. That's something I want to go back and do eventually. I got up to a 12-mile long run, and at that point, I thought to myself, oh, I got to do another 14.2 miles on top of that. Maybe I had better things to do with my time. I want to go back and actually potentially try to rectify that, because I think it'd be really cool to be able to say, yeah, I ran a marathon. But really, that's at this point, I don't know. I'd have to train a lot more. It's been a long time since I was training for that marathon. But anyway, I really enjoy track and field events. And this game, Track and Field 2, was a very interesting mix of different events that you could play. And I have such fond memories playing all of the different events here, some of which made sense, some of which I never really figured out the best way to beat other than cheating, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a couple minutes. But I would play these games. I remember playing the fencing competition. I remember doing the long jump and the triple jump and the hammer throw and, what else? The pole vault. I had so much fun playing these games, playing the games that were included in this collection. And granted, they were kind of like mini games, because at the end of the day, you're playing all of these different events in order to hopefully win the gold at the end of the day. But I remember having so much fun playing this game and playing all of the different games included within that game, or at least all of the events included within Track and Field 2. I was never really that great at it, though. A lot of the games required button mashing, like I think it was like a BA alternate kind of move with the buttons, like BA, like you have to press it as rapidly as possible. I remember that the hammer throw in particular required the rotational movement of the D-pad, which, let me tell you, that was blister-inducing before Mario Party was blister-inducing. And just imagine doing that with a D-pad as opposed to an analog stick. That hurt. That hurt my thumbs so badly, or at least my one thumb, so badly as I was trying to do the rotation required to get a good throw on the hammer throw. Fencing was much more my speed, because it didn't require a ton of different fast button presses. It was more just you against your opponent. You had to pick the right moves in order to try to strike them before they struck you. But I loved all the different games. Even if I wasn't all that good at it or good at the individual events, I still loved them. Oh, there was swimming. There was swimming too. That was a lot. There was a high dive. Oh my God, I want to play this game. I have not thought about Track and Field 2 in any degree until right now, other than knowing that I wanted to include a song from Track and Field 2 for today's episode. But I hadn't really thought about the game as much. And now I'm thinking about it, and man, do I really want to play it. Well, anyway, Track and Field 2 was really cool, but I never really got all that far in it. And I never really got all that good with the events using a traditional NES controller. But, my friends, my family purchased for me the NES Ultimate controller. I don't know if I've told you all this before, but the quickest way to get me to want to buy something is to label something the ultimate or the best or the biggest or whatever. If you say this is the ultimate controller and it will let you do things that you just can't possibly do otherwise, just take my money because I want it. I want it so bad. And the NES Ultimate controller was definitely that. So this is the controller, if anybody hasn't seen this. It's a big arcade-style joystick in the center of the controller. And then there are mirrored A and B buttons, big buttons, not like the little buttons on the normal NES controller, but big arcade-styled buttons, kinda. They weren't, they were concave, not convex, if I remember correctly. And they were on both sides, and ostensibly so that either left-handed or right-handed people could use the controller, which was actually a really nice touch for back then because left-handed usage was not something that a lot of controllers or video game manufacturers were actually thinking about. The NES Ultimate controller had that, and also it allowed you to then potentially for games like track and field alternate between A and B, but use the two index fingers from your two hands, which might improve overall performance. The joystick would allow you to improve performance on the hammer throw because rotating a joystick is way easier than rotating a D-pad and had less blisters as a result. But one of the coolest features, at least from my perspective back then, was the fact that not only did it include a slow motion kind of thing, which I never used for track and field 2, but it bears mentioning. There was a slow motion feature. Now you might be thinking, how the heck can a controller do slow motion? How could a controller make a game do slow motion? Well, all it did was if you activated slow motion, it would constantly pause and unpause the game rapidly. So that was slow motion for the NES using this controller. You would activate it, and I think there were a couple of different speeds, if I'm remembering correctly. Maybe not. I might be making that part up. But you would activate slow motion, and it would just hit start repeatedly, which was traditionally the button on the NES for pausing the game. It would just continuously send start commands to the NES, which would make the game pause rapidly, which would then cause the game to go into quote-unquote slow motion. Some games it worked really well because there was nothing else associated with that start button. Other times, when you would press the start button, the game would have a little chime or a little ding that would play as you would pause the game. For those, slow motion became absolutely awful to listen to because there was a constant stream of do, 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 or whatever the noise was associated with pausing the game. I never really used slow motion all that much, but I thought it was the coolest thing that it was included. But something I did use, and something I did use to cheat at Track and Field 2, was the auto fire settings. This was one of the coolest things I have ever had on a controller because you didn't just activate auto fire. It wasn't just a switch that you flipped and activated auto fire. There were two different dials, one for the A button, one for the B button, and you could adjust the amount of rapid fire for each of those buttons independently. So what you would do is if you wanted to have really rapid fire, you would turn that dial up all the way for both A and B, and then you would hold down the button and auto fire away. But the really cool thing is that let's say you didn't want auto fire for a button. Let's say one of the buttons was to jump. Well, you didn't want to auto-fire that button because that would impede your ability to actually jump. So you would just set the auto-fire on your shooting button, but not on your jump button, and you'd go off and you'd have an unfair advantage in whatever game you were playing that would be jumping and shooting. Anyway, the controller was amazing. I used that auto-fire to get past a lot of the button mashing in Track and Field 2. Once I got this controller, I went back and I dominated Track and Field 2. I dominated all of the running events. I dominated the swimming events. The high jump or the high dive, you didn't really need to use the rapid fire thing, but the joystick helped with the rotational movement that you needed in order to pull off the tricks. And the rotational movement for the joystick absolutely helped with the hammer throw, where I was now able to get so farther. I was able to throw the hammer thing, whatever you call it, so much further than what I was otherwise able to do. I loved my NES Ultimate controller. I hope it still exists somewhere in my family home. I don't have it personally on me. I'm hoping that it's somewhere in my parents' house because that was my favorite thing. It was it was my favorite thing. And I will always associate, even though I used the NES Ultimate controller with a ton of different games, I will always associate it with Track and Field 2 because it let me cheat to win. I finally did win the gold after tons of time trying This was an example of bringing the right tool for the right job. And in this case, the right tool was a really overpowered controller that let me cheat to win. But regardless, Track and Field 2, awesome game. But the real memory with Track and Field 2 has to do with that controller, a controller that I still love today, that if I can find it, I will absolutely put it on my shelf in a position of prominence, because it is, oh, and they even had suction cups on the bottom of the controller, like if you wanted to attach it to a table so that it wouldn't rock around or move around as you went. Man, I love that controller. That controller is amazing. Track and Field 2, also amazing. I will always remember that game. I will always remember the controller associated with that game. It will always have a special place in my heart. We're going to move on to our next game on the list, which is Sweet Home, and this is the Fresco theme. This one is a little bit different than all of the other selections on the list, because all of the other games that we've talked about so far and all of the other music we've talked about so far are associated in some way with my youth, from when I was younger, when I was a kid playing the NES on our CRT television in our family room, and I have fond memories of those experiences. I never played Sweet Home back then, mainly because I didn't even know it existed, primarily because it only existed in Japan. I had no idea what the heck Sweet Home was. I had no idea it even was a thing back when I was younger. Fast forward many years, and I guess I'll talk a little bit about my prior podcasting experience, because this is where this particular game and song comes into play. Before Classic Gaming Today, years before Classic Game Today, I had hosted a different podcast called Point and Click, an adventure game podcast. The podcast devoted exclusively to the adventure game genre. That was the tagline. You know, I've got to have a tagline for all this stuff. Whether the taglines are good or not doesn't matter, but I always have to have it as part of the intro. Welcome to Point and Click, an adventure game podcast. The podcast devoted exclusively to the adventure game genre. Just to give everybody, or get everybody in the mood. So I had made this podcast. It was devoted exclusively to point and click adventure games, or more generically, adventure games, because there were a couple of games I played on there that were not point and click. They were more text parser kinds of experiences. Interestingly, I have remastered every single episode from the Point and Click podcast, and all of those games now appear somewhere in our overall episode listing for Classic Gaming Today. So very long time listeners will remember some of those games. The one aspect of the Point and Click podcast that did not transfer over in that remastering process was the talk through. So as I was doing Point and Click, the way I had done the Point and Click podcast was in many ways similar to what we have with Classic Gaming Today. I would begin every episode with some sort of history about the game in question. We only had that podcast for 25 episodes or so, and it was a bi-weekly kind of release. So I only did Point and Click podcast for around a year. But I will say I had gotten a lot of great feedback about that particular podcast. And the thing that I did differently with that was very different than most podcasts was I included a talk through section of the podcast. You can think of a talk through as an audio walkthrough. So basically, rather than going out to YouTube and watching somebody play a game from beginning to end, or rather than going out to game FAQs and looking up a walkthrough and seeing what you have to do at each stage of the game, I would talk through the entire experience, the entire story, the entire act of playing any of these adventure games. I would talk through, I would provide my commentary, I'd provide some critique where necessary around different puzzles or designs or things that I liked, things that I didn't like. It made every single episode of the Point and Click podcast pretty darn long. I mean, multi-hour affairs in some instances, but it was a lot of fun. It was also a lot of work. And as I continued to do the Point and Click podcast, and as I was coming upon the 1-year anniversary of the podcast, I recognized that I could not keep working in this way. It was too much work, even on a bi-weekly schedule, even releasing an episode every 2 weeks. It was just too much work to get through the games, to take all of the copious notes needed in order to construct the talk through as we were going through the podcast itself. It was so much work that I couldn't possibly keep it up. So I decided after 25 episodes, after a single year of doing that podcast, to retire my podcasting microphone. But I did say at the time that I would be back in the future. I had an idea back then for a new format for a show that was going to be less focused on the gameplay and more focused on just the history. I was going to focus on these huge historical deep dives into all of the games that I would play. I didn't know when that was going to happen, but I knew that I wanted to do it. So fast forward, I don't remember exactly how much time, maybe a little bit over a year. Fast forward around a year beyond the end of Point and Click, the adventure game podcast, or an adventure game podcast. Fast forward around a year, and I was ready to begin my latest podcasting adventure. This one was called Saved Games, which are focused on the experiences that stay with you long after you turn them off. I think the tagline was a little bit better than that, or a little bit more streamlined, but it was effectively, these are the gaming experiences that stay with you long after you turn them off. So Saved Games. I thought it was a great concept. Anyway, so I launched this new podcast, and I had grand visions for covering all sorts of games. I had gotten a notebook, and I actually wrote down with my hand individual games I wanted to cover. I wanted to cover all these different games, and I had like a list of like 50 games that I was going to focus on. So I sat down and I began making those episodes, and I recognized that the amount of historical deep dive that I was going to for each of these individual episodes was also extensive, because even though I wasn't focused on the gameplay of the games, I wanted to play every single game that I was talking about. Even though I wasn't going to talk specifically about my gameplay experience, I wanted to play every single game. So when I did an episode on Doom, let's say, I couldn't just play Doom for that episode of the podcast. I had to play id Software's prior games to really have an understanding of what I was talking about. So I played the entire Commander Keen series. I played all of these different games as I was going through, or at least I tried them. I didn't necessarily play them all to completion, but I wanted to try them to get a sense of all of these different games. I then had an episode on Resident Evil. And that episode of Resident Evil, I went deep into the history behind survival horror. And it was during that episode's research that I came upon Sweet Home, which was a Famicom exclusive title that was, many believed, and I believe this to be true, to be the immediate predecessor to Resident Evil. And we talked about Sweet Home in our episode on Resident Evil. And the reason we talked about that is because I had already done the research way back for Saved Games when I was doing our Resident Evil episode. But I remember, as I was preparing that Resident Evil episode for Saved Games, not for Classic Gaming Today, because Saved Games only lasted for around 3 episodes, I think. It was very short-lived before I recognized, I can't keep doing this either. And then I eventually shelved that one. I always vowed to come back to the podcasting space. I did. That is what Classic Gaming Today is, and I'm in a much better spot now in terms of overall workload and balancing things out than what I was back then. But that's kind of the genesis of my podcasting journey. Putting that all aside, though, I played Sweet Home for the Saved Games podcast for my episode on Resident Evil, and it blew me away. It was like this survival horror RPG kind of experience. It was spooky. It was actually based on a Japanese movie that had come out. It was a whole licensed kind of thing. I ended up watching the Japanese movie associated with the game because I just thought it was so cool. It was such a great game. And the music included in the game definitely stuck with me, especially the fresco theme, which I just think is a really haunting piece. I think they did a great job composing the music for Sweet Home. Sweet Home is one of those games that if you're going to play it, and you don't know Japanese, you're going to need to pick up a fan translation. Luckily, there is a fan translation of the game, which is the version that I played back when I was doing the Resident Evil episode for Saved Games. But it was just a great experience, and it really showed me how different elements of that game were transfixed and transposed for Resident Evil and what you would eventually see across the Resident Evil series, not just in Resident Evil 1, but Resident Evil 0, the whole concept of not being able to keep all your items on you and leaving items on the ground at different spots. Sweet Home did it. And they did it back in the late 80s. I want to say, I can't remember the exact year that Sweet Home came out, but it was a hugely impactful game for the Resident Evil series. And even from a personal perspective, Sweet Home was very impactful because it gave me exposure to something I had never experienced before. It was ultimately part of a failed podcast venture, but it really opened my eyes to what else is out there and how important video game history can be. I was always involved and engaged by video game history. I've always enjoyed the historical aspect of any of the games that I played. Sweet Home, though, that really showed me that there is more to gaming and gaming history than what you might assume. And there's so much history that a lot of people don't even experience because it's not readily available to them. Sweet Home being a Japanese exclusive title on the Famicom, I would have had no way of playing that or knowing it existed back when I was younger. Luckily, the modern amenities coming with the internet and the readily available access of information literally everywhere has allowed me to rectify that issue. But without that, I would have never known about Sweet Home or how much I enjoyed the game or how influential that game would be. So for those reasons, as well as the fact that it was tied to some of my prior podcasting adventures, I definitely had to include Sweet Home on this list because the music and the game certainly mean something to me. Anyway, I think that's going to be the last song for today. I have a few others on my list that I was ready to talk about, but maybe we'll save those for Volume 3. The one thing I do want to say, though, is that as I've said many times before, music has the ability to transfix you, to really make you engaged in whatever experience that you may be experiencing. And even beyond that, music creates such amazing associations from a memory perspective as well as just an overall engagement standpoint. Music in video games is so important to me. I love all sorts of video games. I love the music that comes along with them, and I love the memories that those musical pieces bring back as I listen to them again. We've just gone through a bunch of songs today from my own personal vault of video games and music that have meant something to me. I'm definitely curious of hearing about what all of you feel. And we just had our listener grab bag episode not all that long ago, so you all did share some of those experiences, which I absolutely appreciated. But definitely keep letting me know what those personal experiences are. What are those games? What is the music that really means something to you? The ones that bring you back to a prior time in your life, whether that's childhood or a prior personal experience. Whatever it is, music is amazing. I love music. I love music in video games, and I love sharing my personal experiences with all of you. That was our latest Sounds of the Classics episode focused on the NES. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Slam City with Scottie Pippen. So definitely write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience and get your comments featured on the show. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome. It means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Slam City with Scottie Pippen. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.